My grandmother, my mother's mother, her name was Teibel Lipsker. Luba Alta Teibe, three names. Luba Alta Teibe, which means an old lovebird. Luba is love. Alta, old. Teibe is a toib, a bird. Old lovebird, or love old bird. Luba Alta Teibe, or Teibel. She passed away a number of years ago at the age of 94. Chaf Hei Shvat, the 25th day of Shvat. This is a personal and fascinating story about my grandmother. This is my mother, Tzelanga Yod, and her mother. She was a very special woman. You know, the matriarchs of that generation who went through unfathomable turmoil and agony, and she was a refugee. She lived in Georgia, in southern Russia. Hitler could not get there because of the Kafkaz mountains, the Caucasus mountains. They could not get there. The Germans could not get there. So the Jews were safe. But they were living in Stalinist Russia under the Soviet communist regime. It was not an easy life. And then after the Holocaust, like many Russian Jews, they escaped through false passports because Stalin allowed the refugees, citizens of other countries, to leave Russia. So they forged their passports. And my grandfather, my grandmother, and their children, who were young, the oldest, my mother, who was a young girl, they left Russia. And, they went to the DP camps, displaced person camps. My mother told me they were given an apartment with one room. And you're talking about a mother and a father with quite a few children. They had 5 or 6 children at the time with one room. And, you went from one place to another place, one place to another place. Thank God they were alive. That itself was a great miracle. They were thankful for being alive. Until finally, in 1947, they arrived in the United States of America. My grandmother once lamented to the Lubavitcher Rebbe that she suffers from depression. She's not in a good mood. She's anxious. She has anxiety. And she has some form of melancholy, depression. Today, they send you off to a therapist. But this is the days when, the Jewish world was somewhat different. These are the survivors' generation who didn't have anxiety. I'm laughing. Who didn't have anxiety? Yeah. Who didn't have trauma? I mean, the trauma was endless. The question you had to ask yourself was, do we move on or do we wallow in the trauma? But very few people, there were those who didn't have trauma, but very few. But she once told us to the Rebbe. And what do you think the Rebbe told her? He gave her a fascinating instruction. My grandmother was a very good dancer. She was an exceptional dancer. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe suggested to my late grandmother that she should go to as many weddings as she can. Not just relatives or friends. Weddings of Jews. And dance. Dance at the wedding. And bring joy to the Kala, to the relatives, to the family, to the community. And this my grandmother did for 40 years. For approximately 40 years. Whenever she could, she went to a wedding. Not weddings of friends or relatives. For sure she went to weddings of friends and relatives. She herself married off 9 children. But she went to any possible wedding she can. Invited or uninvited. She would go. And she would dance, and dance she could. Sie had getanzt and getanzt and getanzt. She was a really good dancer, a skilled dancer. And everybody knew, Teibel Lipsker is here, it's Zayn Lebedik. Very few people knew the reason she's doing it. She's doing it because she's trying to find her own reservoir of joy. But in that process of bringing joy to so many people, she herself found the fortitude, the courage, the resilience, the resolve that she needed to be able to live a noble life, a dignified life, a moral life, a life of deep commitment, dedication, and love. And she would dance. I remember as a child, I would sometimes, if I was at the wedding, my grandmother, so to speak, stole the show. And she wasn't that star. She didn't have to steal the show, but she would start dancing with other women or herself. for a very long time, and then she would go home. But she would dance to the point of exhaustion until she couldn't dance anymore. First of all, I have to say, it was very good exercise. It was probably very good for her health too. The Rebbe killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Besides that, there was the benefit of what it did for her and what it did for everybody else. Particularly, her dancing came to very special use at certain weddings. She lived in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn. Many weddings were people who were Bali Tshuva. Young women and men who grew up in secular Jewish homes and then came back to Yiddishkeit and then chose to get married. And they got married very often in Crown Heights section of Brooklyn or nearby. Dozens and hundreds over the years. Now, they did not have large extended families. Sometimes the families were broken. Sometimes the families wouldn't even come. But even if the families would come, remember their parents and grandparents. Sometimes they were not Jewish. Sometimes they were very alienated from the Jewish people. They didn't even know the traditions and the customs of a Jewish wedding. And it's not like these girls and boys grew up, in large classes and communities and 100 relatives and 300 relatives like some of you, and everybody was at the wedding. They didn't have those families. Sometimes you had a little nuclear family, 1 or 2 or 3 people, and maybe 1 uncle or 1 aunt. So these weddings could have been a little on the dull side. And my grandmother, when she heard that a Baal Tshuva is getting married, this was her wedding. She would go and she would dance away, and it was really, really beautiful. Why am I telling you this story? My uncle, my mother's brother, married off his youngest child. This is 12 years ago. 12 years ago, he married off his youngest child. This is my mother's younger brother. And I came to the wedding. I had a lecture, I had a shiur that night, so I was somewhere else. I came late. I came very late to the wedding. I was coming towards the end of the dancing. I would be at the end of the dancing. And the benching, the Sheva Brachos, the last dance of the wedding when it's empty. I come to the wedding. It's close to midnight. And I see something strange. My mother is not there. My uncles are not there. My aunts are not there. The only one who's there is the father of the groom and his wife. And the whole family is gone. I'm wondering. I call my mother, like, what happened? Everybody, they're all at the wedding. Like, what happened? Everybody ran away from this wedding? Nobody's there. Nobody's there. Okay. It was very strange to me, but I went in. I gave mazel tov, did some dancing. And I stayed there till the end of the wedding. I leave the wedding, and I hear what happened. My grandmother, who was 94 years old, she was home. And the last few years, she was basically home. And that night, in the middle of the wedding, she wasn't feeling well. She had a hard time breathing. So the assistant, the person who was there, helping her medically, called a cousin of mine, who was at Sola, came over, said she has to go to the hospital. So they took her to Methodist Hospital in Brooklyn. My mother is the oldest daughter, and she was at the wedding. So my cousin from Sola right away called my mother and his mother-in-law, my mother's sister, and said that your mother was taken to the hospital, and it's a difficult situation. So my mother told her siblings. And at some point in the middle of the wedding, they all checked out. And they went to Methodist Hospital. They didn't want to tell the brother, who is a son of my grandmother, because it was his child's wedding. They didn't want to schlep him to the hospital. It would have been inappropriate. But they all, sneaked out, hoping it wouldn't make such a ruckus. And they all rushed to Methodist Hospital. My grandmother was taken to the ICU unit, and all of her children, most of her children, went into the room with their spouses, who also came from the wedding. And then some grandchildren who heard about it, and they also rushed to the hospital. So there were around 40 people in the ICU around her bed. The doctors and nurses were quite perplexed of this scene, but they allowed it. They allowed it. She was having a difficult time breathing. But here's the most fascinating thing. They all came from the wedding. So everybody was wearing wedding gowns, beautiful, fancy wedding gowns, beginning with my mother, all the way, all the children, The grandchildren, the granddaughters, the sisters-in-law, daughters-in-law of my grandmother, everybody with wedding gowns because they were coming from the wedding of my first cousin, all wedding gowns, and my uncles and cousins started to sing songs. And they started to sing beautiful, beautiful Jewish tunes, heartwarming and heart-stirring melodies, including Lebedika, happy songs, wedding songs, which my grandmother cherished. Now, the nurses were rubbing their eyes that 40 people in wedding gowns or kapotas, bekishes, suits, with, dressed up. That's how you come to an ICU? It was like you put on a wedding gown because your mother's in the ICU. They didn't realize that everybody was coming from a wedding. And as they were singing these beautiful songs, my grandmother returned her soul to its maker in the middle of the night, the 25th day of Shvat, 12 years ago. And when my mother shared with me, I wasn't there because I came late to the wedding and I found out later that she just passed away. So I already went only afterwards. But as the next day we all went to the funeral and hundreds of descendants escorted my grandmother and they interred her into the Montefiore Cemetery in Queens, just a few feet from the burial place of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I thought to myself, wow, she spent 40 years bringing joy to brides and grooms at weddings. She would dress up in a beautiful wedding dress or gown, and she would go dance away. And when she returned her soul to its maker, as she left the world, she was surrounded by children coming from a wedding, dressed in wedding gowns, quite literally, singing wedding songs, celebrating her life, and that's how her neshama went back to be embraced by its Father in heaven and remain in his bosom. Because the way we live and the way we interact in our lives, it doesn't only impact the people that see it, of course, it also creates very deep it has a tremendous influence on the energy of the world and our own energy. And sometimes it's expressed itself in fascinating ways.